The dust hung heavy in the air, a thick, suffocating blanket that tasted of ancient earth and impending violence. The mountainous region of Paktika Province, Afghanistan, was a landscape of brutal, raw beauty. But for Lieutenant Mark Donald, it was simply the backdrop for a war that had become his entire existence. He was a Navy SEAL, a title earned through the crucible of Bud/S and years of service, but his true identity was more complex. He was a combat medic, and a healer wired with the warrior ethos, a paradox of a man who carried a rifle to create the very casualties he was sworn to save. On this day, October 25, 2003, that internal conflict would be drowned out by a far more immediate and violent reality. The convoy, a mixed unit of American Special Operations Forces and Afghan militia, snaked its way along a dry riverbed, a natural corridor through the jagged terrain. The Humvees groaned and lurched over the rocks, but their engines echoing off the canyon walls, a sound that seemed to announce their presence to the entire province. Mark was in the lead vehicle, his eyes scanning the ridgelines, the caves, the boulders, any place where an enemy could hide. The air was tense, the silence between the men filled with the unspoken understanding that they were moving through hostile country. They were the hunters, but in this environment the line between hunter and prey was whisper-thin. What the world erupted without warning, the tranquility of the march was shattered by the screaming hiss of a rocket-propelled grenade. It slammed into the canyon wall just ahead of Mark's vehicle. The explosion was a physical force, a giant's fist that lifted the heavy Humvee and threw it back to the ground with bone-jarring force. Before anyone could process the first blast, another RPG found its mark, striking the vehicle directly in front of them. The convoy had been perfectly channeled into a kill zone, and the ambush was sprung. Instantly, the canyon transformed into a deafening hellscape. From the high ground, the cracks of AK-47s merged into a continuous roar. PKM machine guns stitched lines of death across the riverbed, kicking up geysers of dust and rock. The air was thick with lead and the acrid smell of explosives. Mark's training took over, bypassing conscious thought and moving directly to action. He kicked his door open, the world narrowing to a tunnel of immediate threats. He raised his M4 and began returning fire towards the muzzle flashes that winked from the shadows above, his rounds a small defiance against the torrent coming at them. But the healer in him was already cataloging the damage. He saw the lead vehicle, smoking and disabled, its occupants trapped in the open. He saw the Afghan commander stumble and fall, hit. Without a moment's hesitation for his own safety, now Mark vaulted from behind the cover of his vehicle. He sprinted into the open, bullets whipping past him, snapping through the air where his head had just been. He grabbed the wounded commander by his gear and, using sheer adrenaline-fueled strength, dragged him back across the exposed ground to the relative safety of his Humvee's engine block. He was still catching his breath when he saw the driver of his own vehicle. The man was slumped over the steering wheel, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. He was alive, but he was a sitting duck, a perfect target for the enemy gunners who were now focusing their fire on the stationary vehicles. Mark looked at the Afghan commander, then back at his trapped teammate. He had just risked his life for an ally, but this was his brother. There was no choice to make. He went again. He moved around the front of the vehicle, placing himself in the direct line of fire, and the chatter of enemy machine guns was a constant roar. He yanked the driver's door open, the metal shuddering as rounds pinged off it. He saw his teammate was pinned, the wheel and the collapsed dashboard holding him in place. Grunting with effort, Mark reached in, fighting against the twisted metal, and pulled the wounded American from the wreckage. With the driver's body as a shield, he half-carried, half-dragged him to the back of the vehicle. He laid him down. And then did the unthinkable. He spread his own body over the wounded man, using himself as a human shield, while he pulled out his trauma shears and began cutting away the uniform to assess the wound. He could feel the snap of bullets passing through the fabric of his clothes, the wind of their passage a constant reminder of death's proximity. He worked with a frantic, desperate precision. He packed the wound, applied pressure, and did what he could to stabilize his brother long enough to get him out of this hell. But as he worked, he knew in his gut that some wounds were too deep. He felt the life slipping away from two of his teammates, Chief Carlson and Muller, their injuries too grievous for the rudimentary care he could provide in the middle of a firefight. The healer's heart broke even as the warrior fought on. The ambush showed no signs of letting up. Pinned down and taking casualties, and they were being methodically slaughtered. They could have tried to make a break for it, but that would mean leaving the wounded to die. Mark knew the only way out was through. He saw the Afghan soldiers in the disoriented squad, their eyes wide with fear on the verge of breaking. He remembered his own training, the leadership principles drilled into him. He couldn't speak their language, but action is a universal tongue. He began gesturing, pointing, shouting, and pushing them into positions. Now he took charge of the terrified men, organized their fire, and directed them to lay down a base of suppressive fire. Under the cover of this makeshift squad, Mark coordinated with the rest of his team to begin pulling the damaged vehicles and the wounded out of the kill zone, one agonizing meter at a time. Once they reached a modicum of cover, the work truly began. He went from vehicle to vehicle, treating the wounded Afghans, his hands slick with blood, his mind a razor-sharp focus on triage. He cut, bandaged, and stabilized, all while the crackle of gunfire echoed around them. He used his radio to call in a 9-line medevac request, calmly giving coordinates and casualty counts, while chaos reigned around him. He was a rock in the middle of a storm, the calm eye around which the hurricane of violence spun. He managed to get the most critical patients loaded onto the evacuation birds, and watching them lift off and disappear over the mountains before he allowed himself a single breath of relief. Only then did he realize the deep, dull ache of his own wounds. Shrapnel had peppered his skin, and his body was one massive bruise. But the day was not over. Word came over the net that another element, sweeping a different part of the area, had also been ambushed by a large enemy force. The report was garbled, but two words came through loud and clear. Wounded. A critical. Mark's body screamed in protest. He was exhausted, his muscles screaming, his own blood soaking his uniform. The rational part of his brain told him he had done enough. He was a casualty himself. But the medic's instinct, the voice that had driven him his entire life, was louder. Without a word to anyone, without a thought for the fresh hell he was about to enter, he turned and ran. He sprinted 200 meters across the open, a distance that felt like a marathon. And the ground was uneven, the fire from the new ambush just as intense as the first. He could see the enemy positions, could see the rounds impacting around him. He was completely exposed, a lone figure in a tan uniform running towards the sound of guns. He reached the besieged position and slid into cover next to two fallen men. One American, one Afghan. They were gravely wounded, bleeding out fast. He immediately set to work, but the enemy fire was so intense, so accurate, that he was endangering them simply by being there. He did the only thing he could. He physically positioned himself between the wounded and the enemy. He became a human bulwark, his body taking the risk so that theirs wouldn't have to. As he worked, he heard the incoming whoop, whoop, whoop of Army AH-64 Apache helicopters. They were coming in hot, ready to rain down rockets and cannon fire on the enemy positions. The danger zone for friendly forces was clearly marked. But Mark was so close to the enemy, he was inside the minimum safe distance. The rockets would be just as deadly to him and his patients as they would be to the Taliban. He looked at the wounded men, then at the approaching Apaches. He had to move them now. He grabbed the nearest soldier and began a fighting withdrawal. He fired his rifle one-handed while dragging a man, then switched, firing, dragging, and shouting at the surviving Afghan fighters to follow. Then he led them through a 200-meter hail of fire, pulling the wounded to a position of safety just as the Apaches made their gun run, turning the enemy ridgeline into a fireball. He coordinated a second medevac, ensured the wounded were loaded, and only then, as the helicopters disappeared over the horizon for the second time that day, did he allow himself to sit down and shake. For his actions that day, Mark Donald would later be awarded the Navy Cross, and the Navy's highest award for valor, second only to the Medal of Honor. But in a strange twist that spoke to the shadowy nature of the War on Terror, his name was redacted from the citation. For over 2 years, he was the Secret SEAL, a phantom hero whose identity was protected for fear of reprisals against him and his family. His own story was classified, his heroism known only to a select few, and then just a month later he did it again, in another ferocious ambush. Then he once more exposed himself to withering fire to organize Afghan troops, commandeer a vehicle, and lead a desperate charge out of a kill zone. For this, he received the Silver Star. He became one of the most highly decorated warriors of the entire conflict, a man who had proven his courage not once, but twice in the span of a few short weeks. But the medals, the citations, the official praise, they meant little in the quiet moments. The Navy Cross is a beautiful piece of metal and ribbon, but it couldn't silence the screams he heard at night. The Silver Star couldn't bandage the wounds on his soul. The man who had run towards gunfire to save others, the unshaken warrior in the heat of battle, now found himself in a different kind of fight. The enemy was no longer in the mountains of Afghanistan. It lived inside his own head. The ghosts of Chief Carlson and Muller, the men he couldn't save, haunted his every waking moment. But the hypervigilance that kept him alive in combat made him a stranger in his own home, unable to relax, always scanning for threats. He tried to deal with it alone, the way a SEAL is supposed to. He buried it deep, under layers of discipline and denial. But the pressure built, and the cracks began to show. He was irritable, distant, and angry. His family felt the presence of a stranger in their home, a man who was there, but not there. The same courage that propelled him into enemy fire kept him from admitting he was wounded in a way that no medic could treat. He was a man drowning in full view of everyone, yet refusing to call for help because he believed he was supposed to be able to swim. He hit a low point, a darkness so complete he couldn't see a way out. It was in that abyss that he finally did the hardest thing he had ever done. It was harder than BUD/S, harder than running through that ambush. He picked up the phone and called his mother. He didn't have the words to explain the chaos inside him, but he didn't need them. He just said he was struggling, that he needed help. Her response was simple, profound, and exactly what the medic in him needed to hear. "I know, mijo," she said, using the Spanish term of endearment. "That's why I called you." She had known. She had felt his pain across the miles, and had been waiting for him to be ready. But her words shattered the last of his resistance. He finally let go of the pride and the fear and accepted that he needed help. He began to see therapists, to talk about the things he had seen and done. He started to learn that post-traumatic stress wasn't a sign of weakness, but a wound, a deep, complicated wound that required just as much care and attention as a gunshot. He began the slow, painstaking process of reconstruction. He learned to separate the warrior from the husband and father. And he started writing, using words as a tool to process the chaos, to externalize the demons so he could see them for what they were. His journals became a lifeline, a way to navigate the treacherous terrain of his own mind. He realized that the same principles that made him a good medic, assess the situation, render aid, never leave a fallen comrade, applied to his own recovery. He had been wounded in a war far from home, and he had to learn to be a medic for himself. Years later, I had retired and at peace, Mark Donald looked back on that October day not as a moment of heroism, but as a moment of duty. The Navy Cross, the Silver Star, They were on behalf of the team, he insisted. The real heroes, he'd say, were the ones who didn't come home, and the families who supported the ones who did. The story of the secret SEAL had eventually been revealed, his name finally attached to his deeds. But the truest part of the story wasn't about the day he ran through fire. It was about the years he spent learning to live with the memory of it. It was about the courage it took to admit he was hurt, and the unyielding strength it required to heal. He was hurt, deeply and permanently scarred by the violence he had endured and witnessed. But like the man who stood unshaken in that Afghan riverbed, he refused to fall. He rebuilt his life, brick by brick, using the same determination that had defined him as a SEAL. And in doing so, he proved that for a true warrior, the battle is never truly over, and the most important person to save is sometimes yourself.